All right, welcome everybody to another edition of the Queer Profits Podcast. I am so excited and honored today to be talking to Jennifer Brown, who I love that she has a name I can pronounce and not screw up. Jennifer and I've never met in person, but we've kind of known each other and followed each other for a long, long time. And I'm just really honored and excited that she has agreed to do this. And I have no idea what we're going to get into today, but
we're up for that.
Right.
Fine.
Exactly. So we're just a reminder at Queer Profits Podcast, we are about 3 pillars, which I'm sure we're going to hit all 3 of today with Jennifer. But it's all about inclusion, community, and growth, both business and personal, because you can't have one without the other. So without further ado, Jennifer, why don't you tell them who you are and kind of what you do, and we'll go from there.
Yeah, sure thing, Diane. Thank you for having me. So I have been in the diversity, equity, and inclusion space for about a decade. I've been a business owner and a certified LGBT-owned company for all of that time. And also we're certified woman-owned too, which I might want to put a little asterisk next to. So, but we are a proud diverse supplier. When I say we, I have a team of about 20 folks. And we consult to mainly large organizations to build their diversity, equity, and inclusion strategies. And sometimes that includes work with ERGs or affinity groups. Sometimes that means setting up diversity councils. It could mean building an entire strategy for a large company. And inevitably, there's also training in the mix, and we will do inclusive leader training. So focusing on the behaviors and the skills and the mindset shifts that we need to see amongst employees, people managers, and executives to kind of create the circumstances for a shift towards more inclusive cultures of belonging where everyone can thrive, as I say in the subtitle of my most recent book. So that's my passion. I've also been out for 25 years and I've had a partner of 20 years, Michelle, and I do believe that my LGBTQ identity and experience really informs my skill sets and my toolkit for doing this work. But I am also previously an opera singer, so I have a master's in vocal performance, and I also have a second master's in organizational development and leadership when I discovered that singing just wasn't going to work out for me. And it was my parachute, but it ended up being really my lifelong passion and such a deep privilege to do this work every day and to be, considered somebody who could actually shift such an important arena.
Yeah, so you've been doing this for 10 years. How did you get into, because, we hear a lot now about diversity and inclusion in today's world, but 10 years ago, kind of not so much. So How did you kind of get into this sort of niche area?
Yeah, it is. It's a niche and nobody knows about it. I'll tell you, I think that the Out and Equal, there used to be local affiliates for Out and Equal. And I would imagine a lot of listeners know what Out and Equal is. I've been involved for a long time, like 15 years at least, as a volunteer. And we used to lead this New York affiliate. And I was on this committee with all of the, I think, very early voices in LGBTQ sort of corporate advocacy. So the person at IBM, the person at Deloitte, the person at Merrill Lynch, they were on this board with me. And I just came to understand the value of our voice and our input to steer our companies towards more resonant marketing strategies, for example, towards better and more inclusive recruitment practices and retention practices. And I didn't know that was a thing back then. And then I learned that there was such a thing as a chief diversity officer, and I didn't know what that was. And so anyway, P.S., long story short, I kind of put the pieces together and pivoted my company, which was originally 10 or 12 years ago when we started, more of a team development, leadership, coaching firm. We pivoted to that DEI specialty once I kind of realized that I had a strong point of view and a lot of credibility. And it wasn't just LGBTQ space. It was what to do with women in the workplace, what to do with anyone who's marginalized or underrepresented. And that's the piece I feel like that has really, really clicked in and finally allowed me to work from this total alignment in terms of skill set, passion, abilities, mindset, desire for change and impact, etc. So it's really cool how it's all come together. And for a while, I was an HR person in the early days before I had my company. And so I was, but I decided I needed to be a sort of irritant from the outside. I needed to be that third party that could tell the truth and challenge and advocate. And not sure it would have been the right fit for me to be an employee. I really needed to make sure I was listened to in a different way. And we can get into that if you'd like a little bit, but you can never be a prophet in your own land, as they say. So these days I enjoy that opportunity to enter the space and the conversation from this place of having been a published author, and I'm listened to in a certain way. And I think that that's probably the best role for me to play. I know how to play that role. It feels comfortable. It feels like the right role. Yeah. And it's been great to kind of just be in the center of this very fast developing topic. As you know, I mean, we're really like having conversations we never had even a year or two ago on the topic of DEI. So I'm right in the center of all that.
Yeah. So, I think I know the answer, but I want to hear what your perspective on this is, because you talked about the author of the book, and you're the author of more than one book, but specifically the last book. Do you think that being the author of the book has put you in that position of more of being the expert? And so do you think that you're listened to and, for lack of a better word, respected more because you're the author of a book?
Yeah, I recommend for everybody I mentor or speak to where I recognize their genius and they may not be recognizing it yet, that I say, you must have a book. You really, it is a step change in terms of your reputation and your credibility and your fees. If you're somebody who wants to speak for a living, it's really necessary actually to have a book to get you past a certain threshold in terms of fees and the kinds of gigs that you'll be invited to. It's also really formative to write a book. It's a journey into sort of your deepest soul, and it's hard for a reason. It's really, and trust me, I dreaded it, and it was difficult, and it never gets any easier for me. And I'm on the second one, and I try as I might. It sort of comes back to, it's kind of like writing a TED Talk. It comes back to the difficulty of taking all of who we are and sort of packaging it into one particular message that's most important, and sort of tuning out a lot of the extraneous stuff. And I like to think of it as saying, like, if you could leave people with one thing, what is that thing? And a book is something people can hold in their hand, and they can feel that they're with you. They can feel they can learn from you. They feel intimate, I think, and they bond with you in the written word in a very unique way. And some of my favorite feedback is from people who are super into the book and send me their favorite passages and, quote it and take screenshots of a page. And as an author, there is nothing that quite feels like that. And you really realize, if you can't ever see me in person, or maybe my company isn't working with your company and I'm not coming in and speaking, it's an artifact that people can hold. And so everybody who's at all interested in having this kind of bigger impact, I really recommend a book.
Yeah, that's great. So let's talk a little bit about sort of where the diversity and inclusion piece has gone. I mean, you just said it's changed so much in the last year or two. It's certainly changed a lot in the last 10 years that you've been involved. So talk a little bit about sort of that piece of, how it's grown and changed and where we are today as opposed to, even a couple of years ago.
Oh yeah, there's so much change. I think the political realm has, in the last couple of years, has taught a lot of us that that we need to bend that arc of justice. It's not just going to happen. And that's been a big wake-up call for a lot of us, particularly, I think probably if you ask people of color, they would say, well, we've always known this, wake up, white people. Right. So I think what we're in the midst of is white people reckoning with their whiteness, thinking about what that means and the implications and how they're participating, perhaps often unwittingly, in these systems that are inherently oppressive. So I think there's a huge opening to that. And that's a piece where I feel that I can kind of walk in and be helpful in that space, given my obvious ethnicity. That I can say, hey, wake up, do the work. Here's the work I'm doing. Here's the things I don't understand. Here's the things that I'm sure I need to shift in myself, because I'm a work in progress too. But since I have a platform, I encourage people to start to talk about this. The other piece is, I'd say, intersectionality. So that overlapping stigmatized identities, and that's what intersectionality means. And so what that looks like in organizations, for example, is that you've got a young workforce that's coming in that wants to be a part of all of the diversity networks because they're multi-identitied. And they want to be, for those identities that they're not directly in primarily, they want to be allies for that identity, right? So there's this tremendous, I think, fluidity of the understanding of identity amongst younger people. And now, the generation Y is the dominant generation in the workplace from a numbers perspective. I think that's flipping like literally next year, but I think some people think it's already flipped. So that's kind of bringing this whole different valuing of inclusion to the workplace and putting it on the table and keeping it on the table and saying, hey, I expect, to work for this company. I want to see what my leaders actually walking the talk about this. Do they really understand it? What is the brand about? How do we behave in the world? It's not just about profits, but it's actually about our impact and our social good. So companies are very much, I think, behind the curve in terms of their ability to respond to this well. I think they've hoped that diversity would go away. They probably hoped that it would be, once we do our unconscious bias training, we're done and I'm going to check the box and that's all the bandwidth I need to really give to it.
Right.
And that's not true. And by the way, it's never been true. We know it's never been true, but it's just been difficult to get people's attention. And I think now we have demographics on our side. The world is not becoming less diverse. It's becoming more diverse. And so guess what? Your customers aren't going to go back to being homogeneous. And you, in order to function as a business in this diversifying world, you've got to mirror that world in terms of who you have on the inside in your workforce. And you and I know, you look at the masthead of companies, you look at the top levels, we don't see a lot of diversity there.
Right.
So we've got a big mismatch. And we've got a problem also in terms of elevating diverse talent up the pipeline in order to reach that C-suite, in order to reach those director, VP, EVP levels. Something happens in there. Something derails us and we get tired and we get angry and we get frustrated and we lose hope and we leave and start our own companies. Sounds familiar.
So, and I imagine that you experience this. I certainly do as a speaker, right? I mean, not only the LGBT piece, but as a woman, right? I mean, I can't tell you how many times I'm sure you experience the same thing. You're the only woman, let alone the only, person of the queer community.
Totally.
If you're at a multi-speaker, kind of thing, and especially at corporations. So I certainly see that.
Definitely.
So Jennifer, let's bring this down to a little bit of a different level. And we didn't talk about this ahead of time, but this is one of the things that sort of is intriguing for me about the whole, we talk a lot about inclusion and diversity and all of that. And I think it means different things to different people, but how do we bring more diversity and more inclusion, which I see as kind of two different things, and yet sort of they go hand in hand inside of our own community?
Oh gosh, one of my favorite questions. So let me define diversity and versus inclusion, quoting Verne Myers, which I like to do. Diversity is being asked to the dance and inclusion is being asked to dance. Asked to the dance is the who, right? It's sort of the visible and invisible diversity you may have, you may be able to gather. But if you don't manage the how, is the ability to make that diversity sing, right? To make that diversity really reach its potential. And that requires really good leadership skills. So in that context, the LGBTQ community, which I think is what you're asking about, is fascinating because we have a lot of exclusionary dynamics going on in our community. And so for me as a cisgender white woman who's feminine presenting, but also technically, is a part of the community because of who I love and who I spend my life with and how I identify, it's fascinating to think about myself as both within a community, but also being an ally within the community to those who are not represented in our community, who aren't who, if I can say who's missing from our boards and our committees and our ERG leadership, I'm always going to be the one that's going to say, you know, who is missing? Are we truly being inclusive of all the voices and all the identities within our community, which is a marginalized community, technically speaking, right? So I think that's the shift that we have to start to think about. And it's all of our jobs. You know, we're in this community, but it's our job to be inclusive leaders within the LGBTQ community.
Yeah.
And so I just think that we assume somehow that because we're in this community, we do this naturally and we don't really need to pay a lot of attention to it. And I actually completely disagree.
Yeah.
You know, that we've got to practice this.
True. You know,
Yeah.
I think the opposite is true. If you go to, you know, an LGBT event, at least my experience is that, and I've talked to enough people that pretty much everybody sees this, and yet none of us are taking that really active approach, which is part of what I'm trying to do here. But, you know, all the gay men are in one place, all the lesbians are in one place, all the transgender people are in one place, all the, you know, and then if we have Black people, you know, they're in another place. It's like, come on, man.
I know.
I was telling a story the other day when I first moved back to Atlanta after having been gone for about 8 years in Florida. I went to an event and I was over talking to a couple of the couple of gay men, and actually another lesbian walked over and said, "Diane, come on over here. Let me introduce you to the guy." I mean, I'm in the middle of this conversation. Like, I'm really good over here, you know? So it was just funny. And I still laughed because I walked over there and lasted for about 5 minutes before, you know, everybody went back to their little clique and I walked back over to the, you know, it's just funny. But I think you're right. You know, I think we have to be more aware of that piece. And, you know, as we're recording this, it's, you know, it's Transgender Awareness Month, and the Day of Remembrance is coming up. And so one of the conversations that I've had previously with one of my transgender folks was, you know, we inside of the community have to, it's important that we're allies, right? But then we also have to move from being an ally to being an advocate. And so it's like, okay, who's going to show up at the, you know, at the Day of Remembrance activities? Is it only going to be trans people, or are lesbians and gay men going to show up too? Right.
That's right.
That's the piece that I think we have to begin to think about. And I guess my question for you is, do you have steps or skills or recommendations for how we do that in a bigger and better way, other than just being aware of it? Or is that the start?
Yeah. Well, even the awareness, I have to say, if you stop the average person and you say, so within the community, do you think of yourself as somebody who is not just an ally, but an advocate, meaning that you're putting kind of concrete action in place? Like the example you just used, which is showing up like in support and solidarity with the community, like physically showing up. Right. I think that most people haven't really done that kind of level of thinking, in my experience, even within the LGBTQ community. Because we may be a little more sensitized to it because it's our identities and we've learned the lessons of marginalization, but it's an extra step that I think many people are not cognizant of, let alone proactively doing. So it is awareness. And then I think the ideas of inclusion, then proactive inclusion, are, like you said, showing up, doing your work, educating yourself about what language to use. Whenever you're storytelling, you think about like where you focus, like whose stories you center. Do we talk about those of most privilege in our community when we have a platform to put a panel together, or, you know, storytell and teach? Because I find myself often in those places. And, you know, I will proactively choose the most unheard stories to make a point. Like, and I will make sure that those people are in my personal networks, and that I'm making time to mentor and be around people across difference from me. And it's very difficult because I even notice it in myself. You know, we tend to gravitate for social time and everything towards people that look just like us. And I have a ton of cis white lesbian friends. And that tends to be like a go-to because there's a comfort level there. And so how I challenge myself is I have a podcast. So I, for example, I literally on my podcast, in terms of guests, avoid certain guests because I know I want to have them on. And I say, no, you need to work harder. You need to reach further outside of who you know. And you need to be proactive in seeking that kind of diversity, that deeper 2.0 and 3.0 level of diversity, because I don't go for what's easy. I mean, if we just go for what's easy, if we just like call that go-to person, likely they're going to look just like us.
Right.
So we have a lot of choices that we can make. And I think we need to put ourselves in what feel like uncomfortable situations. If you're uncomfortable, it means you're learning, and it means you're leading and being an advocate. And for some of us of privilege, or relatively more privilege, being uncomfortable for a moment, it's important to remember that others are uncomfortable constantly. I mean, literally that is their like day-to-day experience of being uncomfortable all the time, because you're never in a room with somebody that shares your identity or visibly shares your identity. So I try to help my audiences, which are full of, usually full of like relatively more privileged people, to get comfortable being uncomfortable, to make sure that they're building in opportunities for that cognitive dissonance, and that they're really revisiting, who do you surround yourself with? Whose stories do you tell? Are you monitoring who's not at the table? Are you noticing these things and championing them so that, other people don't have to be the one that's always bringing up who's missing because they're missing from the equation, right? We can't put that burden on people who are already have the burden of bringing their full selves to that's hard enough. And so to me, the call out of allyship and advocacy is, what can we do that's easier for us to do, harder for others to do? What can we sort of commit to and make happen? And I think that's helpful, because since the word privilege has been weaponized, and I'm trying to take it back, but redefine it and say, we all have it. We all have it. There's not a single one of us that doesn't. And there are ways we're not utilizing the full extent of what we have been given, and the rooms we're in, the access we have, the time we have, and who we give that time to. All of those things, I think, need to be really consciously chosen with the goal of inclusion and really, really equity, which is equity implies the restructuring of things that have been unequal for so long, and sort of questioning business as usual, questioning organizations, questioning policies and procedures and all those other things. Like that's equity work, is sort of dismantling the system that you and I know has been unfairly built for just one kind of person. So like really, it's not just a Band-Aid approach, but we have to actually ask those deeper questions also about like, well, why is this person not at the table? Why do we always do it this way? How come I'm the only one that always brings it up, but nobody else notices it or has the courage to bring it up? Like the deeper questions around like, how do we prevent this from happening in the future? And how do we rebuild it in a more equitable way? That's true advocate work. And that's harder stuff. It's more complex, but that's what's needed.
Yeah. Well, and it's interesting that you said that, because here in Atlanta, I know one of the things that I've asked and gotten the answer to, but is, we have gay pride, and then we have a Black gay pride. And I'm like, why do we do this? And the answer was because we as the Black community don't feel included in the gay pride celebration here. And I was like, wow. And as you look around and look at exactly what you said, right? Boards and those kinds of things, it's like, okay, I get it. And so that's the thing that I think, though, is to me is tragic, right? Is now we have one big celebration, then we have to have this offshoot, instead of how do we as a community address this issue and now fix it, right? Or bring it in so that we can still have this one bigger celebration. I know that's just one short, small example, but it's the piece for me, I think, of, how did women get rights? Well, because men stepped up, right? How did the civil rights movements as related to, Black or brown sisters, how did that happen? Well, white people stood up, right? And so, how have LGBT rights, gay and lesbians, we can marry now, all of that. How did that happen? Well, straight people stood up. And so I think for our, more marginalized brothers and sisters, the trans community and some of the other things, how do we, I think we're going to have to stand up, right? And say, okay, now we have this. How do we have a more inclusive conversation with that? And I think, so I want to throw this back to you. How do we do that as smaller business owners and entrepreneurs who have, a team of just us, or a team of 4 or 5, as opposed to, big C-suite companies? What's the impact that we can make?
We could do a lot. I mean, when you're building a company, how you set your values compass really matters, and pointing it towards making diversity, equity, and inclusion an explicit commitment, even in a small company, is important, because it's like your North Star, and all your hiring and your brand identity can be informed by all that. And it's something that's woven into the fabric, so that it's not sort of a one-off, or, oh, I only talk about our diversity commitment to like diverse candidates. No, like, you don't ever know who's sitting across from you. You don't know what their story is. Most of our diversity is actually invisible. There's so many aspects of us that is invisible, and we could make the wrong assumption about how people identify just by using visual cues. We're often wrong. So I do think that small companies become tomorrow's medium and big size companies. And the more you can have sort of a very strong, steadfast commitment in your hiring processes, in the way that you talk about your brand, and that you can be explicit about these as core values, the different kinds of people you will attract, right? And I know for those of us that might be interviewing for a company, you know, more and more, we're looking at that company critically, and we're saying, do I want to work for that small startup? Do they get it? Will they get me? You know, will I be able to bring my full self to work? And will it be like brushed under the rug, or will it be talked about? And are people comfortable talking about it? And do I have to always maybe feel like a token hire? Like, how am I going to feel? Particularly when people don't see people that visibly look like they share their identity. I think the assumption is made, oh, these people don't get it. They're not, you know, they're not going to get it. And that's the problem. So if you allow yourself to create a homogeneous founding team, if you will, it tends to actually hamper your progress in terms of attracting more diverse talent, because we need to see it to be it. You know, we need to see that, and we need to believe it, not just see it optics wise, but really believe it. And we talk, you know, it's transparent. Like, people, we are in such a transparent age. And so you can't really hide. If you do have a homogeneous founding team, and that's just is what it is, and that happens, right? I mean, often entrepreneurs just grab their friend, you know, and you're in this early stage, and you're like, I don't have time to think about diversity. Right. I think you can still talk about what it means to you. You can be very explicit, and you can talk about the journey you're on. One of the pieces of advice I say is like, don't wait to have something done and tied up in a nice little bow to talk about it, because you're going to be waiting a long time. Right. Because this is a journey, not a destination. So if you look around at your team and it's all white people, or it's all men and one woman, or whatever, I might encourage, like, hey, talk about what your goals or your targets or your intentions are, and then work towards those. It's not a substitute for real action, but I think that goes a long way in terms of communicating your intent to shift and sort of and push yourselves to be sort of steady and steadfast in the commitment to diversifying your workforce as you grow. And I would say, you know, I would like to see more cis, white, straight men talking about their diversity stories. I'd like to see all of us telling more of our diversity stories, particularly the truthful and authentic and vulnerable stories about some of us that look like we're in the some kind of majority group. You know, we all have something that we're covering that we are ashamed of, that we don't think has anything to do with anybody else, and it's just our particular private pain. But chances are, you know, when we say bring your full self to work, there's a lot of us that are not bringing our full selves to work in many respects. You know, we're having a lot of conversations about mental health, for example, and ageism in my rooms. And yet people keep that stuff really, really buried. And until such time as we can normalize some of these truths about ourselves that we're so afraid to share, that we think have nothing to do with work, you know, until we can sort of grapple with all of who a person is and how that impacts our productivity and our presence and our energy and our balance in our life. You know, these are all things that I think really hurt the bottom line. And so we have to figure out, you know, I think if we were sitting here 5 years from now, we're going to have a lot more people who are out about, for example, mental health challenges, both in themselves and in loved ones, or maybe their caregiving commitments. They're more comfortable saying, here's what I need in order to do my best work. Here's what I'm wrestling with. Like, how can the company help me navigate that? Right. But that stuff is still, I think, very, very untouchable. Yeah. The conversation is really broadening way beyond LGBTQ. I mean, trust me, there's all kinds of, hidden disabilities are another thing that's not discussed. Ageism is like the number one thing I hear that people cover in the workplace. All ages, not just people not talking about being a grandparent,
Right.
for example, because they don't want people to know or be reminded of what their age is, but young people saying, I don't want to celebrate my birthday in the office because I don't want people to know how young I am. And I don't want to be associated with the Gen Y millennial stereotypes. And so I sort of distance myself from this generation because I want to be given a fair shot. So it's really fascinating. Like, I relate to it as an LGBTQ person who was closeted for a long time because it feels the same. It's just about different identities, but it's a common experience. So if we can have that as a baseline and know that we are all kind of bargaining all the time with our authenticity, and that those of us who don't pay any attention to this are actually kind of feeding that bargaining. We're literally not challenging somebody's fear of bringing their full self to us, to their work, to their team. So what can we normalize? And for one, I'd like to share my pronouns as she, her, hers, just to give an example, as a cisgender woman who doesn't want to assume that everybody around me is cisgender.
Right.
And it's an educational opportunity. It's an opportunity to show I'm an ally. It opens a door that maybe, who knows, nobody may walk through that door for a year or ever, but at least I opened it.
Right.
At least I didn't make that assumption about like how people identify around me. So just those little practices. And it's incumbent on those of us who I think have relatively more privilege to kind of seed all of this, to create the environment where people feel safer to bring their full selves to us because they think that I can trust this person.
Right.
And that's the kind of environment you should be shooting for, no matter what your company size.
I love that. Yeah. We take ourselves wherever we go, right? I used to say, well, business is business and, the personal is personal, but
No.
you can't put that piece in a box as much as we want to think that we can sometimes. So,
Yeah.
So let me ask you this question, and maybe you haven't had this experience, so I'm just going to throw this out. What do you say to people who say, well, Jennifer, that's easy for you to say, look at you, you're gorgeous, you're beautiful, you're a cis woman, you could pass as straight if you wanted to. And so it's easier for you, right? It's easy for you to say, oh, we should be more diverse and blah, 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 because you could, if you wanted, right? I mean, pass as a straight woman.
Yeah.
So it's easier for you, right? Than it is for me because, my black skin is apparent, or because,
Right.
I happen to have, more not so feminine features as you do. And so people look at me and maybe assume I'm a lesbian. Whereas with you, they may assume that you're straight. How do you respond to that kind of just interaction or thought process?
Yeah, because that is a thing. And I'm glad you asked. I think we all have a role to play in the change equation. And if I look this way, it means that I have certain access and certain permission, and I'm forgiven certain things, whether that's telling the truth, whether that's speaking, challenging power, whether that's literally getting in the room. If I can do that easier than somebody else, what matters is that I get in the room. And what matters is that once I'm in that room, what do I do with that access? And what do I do with that moment and that platform? So that's one thing. I think change is going to take all of us, not just some of us. And people that look like me have to work harder than we've worked in the past. We need to get into the game, and we need to, if the messenger matters as much as the message, like, we need all the messengers, because somebody's going to listen to me differently, not because of anything I'm more brilliant about, but just by a sort of unearned, the visual impression that somebody has and the assumptions they make about how I identify. So that's a fact. I don't agree with it or disagree with it. It just is. I wish that it weren't the case. So that's one commitment I make. The other thing is that once I get into that room, to me, what matters is educating people who look like me about the experience of others that don't look like us.
Right.
And making sure that I am representing that, because that perspective may not be in the room. If I'm the only one that can get in the room, then I got to work really hard in that room to make sure that I'm bringing the lived experience to the extent I can, because that's not my lived experience, but I've studied and studied and studied, and I know the data, and like every inclusive leader should know data and stories of different identities, and be able to share what that feels like, and reflect that back to the people with power, so that we can build empathy.
Yeah.
So that's another piece that I use my stage time, not necessarily talk about my marginalized experience, but to talk about others and make sure I'm literally like, this is the thing you need to think about. If you look anything like me, here's what needs to be on your radar screen. And here's what you need to do to create, that kind of environment around yourself where you're making sure those perspectives are reflected, and that that's heard by people that actually could make a change, particularly from the top. Like if we're talking about executives, like they can have like one aha moment and it shifts everything for them. They can sign one thing or have one conversation and it changes the experience for thousands of people. That's just incredible to have that kind of power. But they are the ones that actually need to be guided and instructed about what to do. Because often they'll look at me and say, Jennifer, I just don't know what to do. Like I get this whole thing and I'm supportive, but I fear I don't know what to say. If I'm left to my own devices, I'm going to do the wrong thing. So we have to help guide that and lay that out as a roadmap. And that's a lot of the work I do, honestly, is to say, okay, you want to be better on a personal level. You want to learn more. You want to be on your journey. And you have an organizational role where you have a lot of institutional power. Yes. So how do I think you should use that time and that energy and that platform? But people really don't know. It's interesting. There's a level of, you could call it laziness if you're in a cynical mood. I just think I find I've got to kind of back up and really educate. And when I say I'm cisgender woman on stage, I always say that.
Yeah.
People look at me like they don't know what I'm talking about.
Well, and even inside of our community, I mean, to interrupt you, I made a mistake. I shared with you earlier. One of the podcasts that I've done is with Gabrielle Claiborne, and I made a mistake with something that I said, and she very lovingly, right? She didn't say, "God, Diane, you're so stupid," right? But that's, I think, what people are afraid of, is that if they make a mistake out of genuinely not knowing, right? It's not, look, I'm in the community and I used the term wrong, right? I made an assumption about, gender dysphoria that wasn't true. And so I think having those open discussions and a platform where we can feel free to say, look, I just don't know. Because quite frankly, sometimes I say, look, I don't understand. Like, what does that mean? Right. And, again, as a member of the community. So how do we expect people outside of the community? Right? I mean, sometimes I Google stuff. I'm like,
yes, good.
The other thing, though, that I think is interesting with the question that I asked specifically is that I think the other piece that you didn't talk about, at least not directly, that I sort of want to bring up, is that I think you have the ability, right, when you get into the room based on whatever, right, the external, then you have the ability, probably more than me, right, to break a stereotype.
That's right.
Because isn't it nice that you can now say, hey, whatever you say, right, but is up to you, but that you're an out lesbian cis woman, blah blah blah, because people are like,
what? Exactly. I was gonna say that.
You don't have lesbian haircut number 5,
right.
Wait, you
no
have
stereotypes.
Yeah, all those stereotypes that I think you now have the ability to break as that person who has gotten in the room.
That's right. And I think that, so I do that, and I will always come out. I force myself to come out, particularly in the rooms where I don't feel comfortable coming out. Those are rooms where I'd rather not, honestly.
Sure.
Because I don't want to lose my audience. I don't want them to go on a tangent mentally. And yet, I know I do it because there's somebody in that room that needs to have a stereotype challenged and have that moment of, wow, I was so wrong. And then I guess, like, what else am I wrong about? Right. Like, where else am I putting my colleagues in a box without really investigating or creating a safe enough space that they would actually come out to me?
Yeah.
Like, so I introduced,
who is you, right? Who needed to know that, oh my gosh, she's like me.
Right. And to see me.
Face it, we still feel like a lot of times, oh my gosh, I thought I was the only one. I hear that often.
All the time. So, and then coming out as cisgender, I use as a talking point and a teaching point to say, I identify as a cisgender woman. How many of you know what cisgender means? I don't see any hands go up. And so I go into a whole thing about what it means and how I use the pronouns, and people are super fascinated with this.
Right.
I think they're seeing their kids, come home and say, Mom, I think I want to be called this name. And, it's happening younger and younger. It's happening with their friends in school. And I think a lot of parents in my audience who are employees of the big companies I speak to are thrown into the deep end of advocacy based on somebody they love or a team member transitioning. And they are like, well, I want to be a good person. I want to do the right thing. And I know nothing about this. And so my call out often is to say, I want you to understand what these words mean, and that identity is a continuum. It's not a binary. Cis, trans, and then gender nonconforming, gender fluid, gender non-binary is in the middle. And by the way, we're all on this continuum.
Right. Somewhere. Yeah.
Yeah, somewhere. And then the pronouns piece around managing people. They say to me, well, Jennifer, like, when should I bring that up? It feels a little bit weird or artificial or like out of the blue. And and I'm like, but you just need to make it a part of your everyday, like when you're launching a project team or when you are hiring new people or you're onboarding or whatever, like just self-identify, just do it. Just trust me that in doing that, you are totally sending a message to the people that need to hear it. And then you're also opening a door to educate those that have no idea why you're sharing your pronouns. What does that even mean? So anyway, it's just a really interesting moment. And those parents will come up to me after the class and say, like, Jennifer, thank you so much for talking about what you did and for being honest about who you are and being so brave, they say. And then they tell me about their kid or they tell me about their family member. And there's just this, like, I can't talk about this at work because I'm closeted for my loved one. And yet this is a huge part of my life right now that I'm coping with, and I don't know who I can talk to about it. And so anyway, it just goes on and on. Like, people really relate to the whole closeting, the perceived need to be closeted about all kinds of parts of our lives is hurting us, and it's hurting our organizations because we then walk around thinking that it doesn't exist because we don't see it. And then we feel lonely, and then we leave because we think that, like, nobody shares our story. And that's not true. It's that nobody's talking about that. So that's the inclusion piece. To me, that's like where the rubber hits the road in terms of, like, what can each of us do? We can be more vulnerable. We can lower, like, if we're an iceberg, we can lower that water line. We can take a chance. We can share something that normally we would have been ashamed to talk about at work, or we think has nothing to do with it or whatever. But it humanizes us, and it creates a safe space, and it opens a door for people who are desperate for a door to walk through. They're desperate for that permission. And then that's how we normalize difference. That's how you know this, we can't even be counted in organizations because LGBTQ people are terrified to check a box. So we don't even know who each other is, let alone HR doesn't know how many of us there are. And they're sort of guessing, but we don't trust the institution, and people with disabilities don't trust the institution either. I mean, there's so much closeted, so many of us are closeted. And I think it very much, I'm not telling everybody to come out because we all are on our own agenda about that, but know that a bravery for you means that your institution will have to listen and notice and maybe hopefully do something about it. And if not, you may not be working for the right company.
And it's usually not as bad as we think, right? I mean, I can remember standing in front of 750 of my peers at an event when I won the Glazer Kennedy Info Marketing, Marketer of the Year award, and I made a comment that 10% of our proceeds at the time went to the Gay Youth and Young Adult Foundation. And that was the first time. And I can remember thinking to myself as I'm standing there with sweat pouring off of me in my hands, I'm like, oh my gosh, I literally thought the hotel was going to like implode around me. And I got the exact opposite, but not everybody has that, that experience, but I certainly get that piece. So we've got just a few minutes left. Just a couple other questions. So tell me what the best either business advice you've ever received or that you would like to impart people with.
I can give you my business owner business owner answer to that. Like say yes and figure out how to do it later. When I started my company, it was just me, and I had to be broad. So I had to make money, and I had to say yes, say yes, I can do that. And for me, that was a big lift as a woman to say that, because what we say in the diversity world, of course, is, the adage is that men will apply for a job if they have 30% of the experience required, and women will wait until they have 120% of the experience in order to even apply, right? So we have this gender difference in terms of, I think, our confidence. And so for me, say yes and and trust that you will figure it out was sort of really especially important for me to hear. And I would give that to any group that is underrepresented in any field. So in entrepreneurs, this is people of color. This is anybody who's felt smaller than, less than, fewer role models, fewer examples of success to follow. You are more talented than you realize. You have everything you need and then some.
Yeah.
And if you don't have the answer, you can find it in your network if you fostered the right kind of network. And particularly, I think when you are new in business, being too much of a niche is not necessarily practical, that you've got to survive. We want you to survive. Right. We want you to get through that first year, second year, third year. We don't want you to go out of business. Like 95% of startups go out of business within the first year or something. And very few of us crack the $1 million revenue number because we also don't scale our businesses. And scaling your business is hard. And there's a whole other podcast there if you ever want to have that conversation. But like I have a team of 20, plus now. And I've worked really hard to kind of reinvest and hire people to my deficit so that I can focus on what I do best and what energizes me. And, today it really hasn't been easy, but it's so important, particularly if you want to grow your business and you want to sell to larger institutions. You might want to think about not being that solo practitioner. You might want to think about growing past the $1 million threshold. Most of us don't make it past that. And, but yet we need small companies of today to become the big companies of tomorrow. And if you're procuring, you're working with procurement like I do with large companies, you have to be a big company in order to serve a big company. Right. Yes. So anyway, I just encourage folks to think about like what kind of company do you want to build? And do you want to, like I get to say now, I really work on the business, not just in the business. And I really realized, I was like, I'm a marketer, I'm a salesperson, I want to be a thought leader. Like what kind of then organization can I build that supports that, but so that I can be happy? Because at the end of the day, like we're nothing if we're not happy. Yeah. Anyway, so it's been a real journey, but I would say like, please consider like, how might you grow your company? Because that means you're creating more economic opportunity. You're shifting the number of diverse suppliers in the world. We need so many more women-owned and LGBT-owned businesses, influencing the world in the way we do business, in the values that we show up with the innovation and the way we think about and solve problems. Like there's so many things that are unique about us, and we're so important as role models for future entrepreneurs. So they can see that and say, well, Jennifer did it and Diane did, like I can do that. And I can see an example of how that was done.
Yeah. And, it's interesting that you said that about the $1 million, because I think one of the things that keeps people from, once you reach 1 million and then scaling past that is that you have to do different things from 1 million plus than you did get to 1 million. And most people just want to do the same things, and that doesn't work. That's right. And so that was an interesting that you brought that up. Yeah, maybe we will do another thing
love that.
Specifically about leveraging. So I know you've got an appointment. And I don't want to make this too long. So why don't you give us contact information? How do people get in touch with you if they, want to go you speak or talk about whatever? How do they get the book? What's the best way to do that?
Yeah. Okay. So here's my details. I have 2 books now. The first was Inclusion from 2017. And the second is called How to Be an Inclusive Leader. Oh, right behind me. It came out in August of 2019. We're having a blast. There's an assessment that goes along with the book. You can learn more about the assessment. It's free. You can take it at inclusiveleaderthebook.com. And then on social, I'm at Jennifer Brown on Twitter, and I am at Jennifer Brown Speaks on Instagram. We are on Facebook and LinkedIn, Jennifer Brown Consulting. And if you want to join our newsletter, send us an email at info@jenniferbrownconsulting.com, or you could go to jenniferbrownspeaks.com and put your name into receiving our newsletter. And I think that's probably the best way to understand, where am I speaking next? And I have a podcast called The Will to Change. So if you're on our newsletter, you'll hear about new episodes and new guests and all that stuff. So please subscribe to The Will to Change as well. Yeah, and just like keep tabs on us. We're moving fast. I'm constantly on planes, trains, and automobiles.
Right.
But join our community and definitely pay attention to, for example, where I'm speaking, and really think about like maybe I could go there. And I'm even open to having you shoot me an email and say, can you get me a comp, or can you get me in, or whatever. Like I'd always be happy to do that. And I would like to exercise my platform in order to enable people to get into some of these really amazing rooms that I am in, so that they can be inspired and transformed and equipped for the road ahead. So, and plus just to meet people in person.
Yeah, that's great. That's great. Well, I want to be respectful of your time. I just want to say thank you again so much for doing this. It was an amazing conversation, as I knew it was going to be. And I'm truly just honored to have spent some time and to gotten to know you a little better. And I love talking about, these bigger concepts and things that affect us in a different way. And I think you really brought a different angle and a different perspective. And so I appreciate that very much.
Diane.
So
thank you very much. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. So again, guys, Queer Profits Podcast. I'm Diane Conklin. Remember, inclusion, diversity, and growth. And as always, we somehow managed to talk about all three today. So until next time, make it a great day.